Bible was ever written, another civilization told the same tale, but with different names, different gods, and a far darker reason for wiping out the world. And what if, hidden within that ancient version, was a clue to people who survived the flood, but were never meant to be remembered? In the hushed halls of the British Museum, there lies a small slab of clay, cracked and weathered, its markings fading with age. To the untrained eye, it's just another artifact. But to those who can read its strange wedge-shaped script, it is something far more dangerous. A voice from 4,000 years ago, telling of a cataclysm so vast, it nearly erased humanity. And in its final lines, it whispers about the ones who escaped and vanished. Before we uncover who they were and where they went, we must first understand how this single tablet shook the foundations of history and why its story still makes scholars uneasy today. The year was 1872. Inside the reading room of the British Museum, under the dim glow of gaslight, a man named George Smith hunched over a table strewn with clay fragments from ancient Mesopotamia. Smith was no aristocratic scholar. He had been a banknote engraver, a man with steady hands and an obsessive mind. Now, he worked here, piecing together the shattered voices of a civilization that had vanished thousands of years ago. That night, his eyes locked on a particular fragment, part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. As he read the cuneiform lines, something in his chest tightened. The words spoke of a divine warning, the building of a vast boat, a flood that swallowed the earth, and a chosen survivor who lived to tell the tale. It was Noah's Ark. Except it wasn't. This wasn't scripture. This was Sumer. The story on the clay tablet had been etched centuries, perhaps millennia, before the book of Genesis. Its flood survivor wasn't Noah, but Utnapishtim. And the god who warned him wasn't the god of Israel, but Ea, known to the Sumerians as Enki, a cunning deity who defied his fellow gods to save a single human and his family. But the reason for the flood was unlike anything found in the Bible. It wasn't humanity's sin. It was the gods' irritation. Noise, overpopulation, perhaps political quarrels among the divine. The texts never fully explain, only that the decision was swift and merciless. If that was true, then this flood was not a cleansing. It was a purge. And purges always have survivors history chooses to forget. When Smith realized what he was holding, he reportedly jumped from his seat, pacing the room in disbelief. The parallels to Genesis were undeniable, yet this version was older, colder, and far more human in its depiction of divine motives. When he read the translation aloud to the Royal Asiatic Society, silence fell over the room. Some clergymen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some scholars leaned forward in fascination. Because if the biblical flood was not unique, then what else in our oldest religious texts had older shadows behind them? And if two civilizations told the same story, separated by centuries, maybe, just maybe, they weren't telling a myth at all. In the next part, we'll leave the museum and step into the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, where archaeologists have dug deep enough to uncover what they believe are the physical scars of the Great Deluge. But those scars tell a story stranger than anyone expected. Digging for the Deluge. To understand the flood of the Sumerians, you have to leave the quiet corridors of the British Museum and step into the dry, sun-bleached plains of southern Iraq, the cradle of Sumer. Here, the ground itself holds memories, not in words, but in layers. Archaeologists knew that if the flood truly happened, It wouldn't be written only in clay tablets. It would be written in mud, in silt, in the very bones of the cities it drowned. And in the early 20th century, they began to dig. In the ancient city of once ruled by kings whose names we met in earlier episodes, they found something strange. Beneath layers of pottery, bricks, and everyday life, there was a sudden, thick band of river silt, clean, fine, and sterile. No tools, no bones, no fire pits. Just a lifeless sheet of mud, as if the city had been smothered all at once. This was no slow accumulation. It was an event. And directly above it, more homes, more streets, more life, a city rebuilt after disaster. But who rebuilt it? And where had the survivors been while the city lay drowned in silence? The same layer appeared in Shuruppak, a city once known for its wisdom, and according to the Sumerians, the last city to exist before the flood. In episode 5, we walked through Eridu, the city of Enki, where myths said the first kings descended from the heavens. In Shuruppak, we stand at the other end of the story, the city where the gods decided humanity's time was up. The silt layer here was over 5 feet thick in some places, sealing the ruins like a burial shroud. It was as if the gods had signed their judgment into the ground. At Kish, another ancient capital, the flood layer appeared yet again, an unbroken horizon of mud. The pattern was clear. Multiple cities, same destruction, same time frame. The debate began. Was this the evidence of the Great Deluge, or merely one of many floods to sweep Mesopotamia's flat river plains? Some argued it was a local catastrophe, a violent overflow of the Euphrates and Tigris. Others whispered of something far larger, a wall of water from the melting of ice far to the north, or a sea surge from the Persian Gulf, swallowing everything in its path. But whatever it was enough for the Sumerians to remember it for thousands of years and to etch it into clay with trembling hands. Yet the question remains, if the flood wiped out all of mankind, as the tablet says, who was left to tell the story? And more importantly, where did they go before returning to rebuild? In the next part, we will step inside the Sumerian version of the flood myth to hear Utnapishtim's own words, preserved on clay, about the day the waters rose, and the strange, divine instructions that made his survival possible. But hidden in his account are hints of others who may have lived through it, far from his ark. The voice of Utnapishtim. The Deluge tablet does not speak in the voice of the gods. It speaks in the voice of a man, Utnapishtim. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he tells his story to the wandering king Gilgamesh, who has come seeking the secret of eternal life. But before Utnapishtim speaks of immortality, he recounts the day the gods tried to erase mankind. His account begins not with rain, but with whispers. The god Ea, called Enki by the older Sumerians, had overheard the divine council's decision. Humanity would be destroyed. The world, they said, had become too noisy, too crowded. The gods could not rest. And so, they would bring a flood, not as punishment for sin, but as a solution to an inconvenience. It's a detail that still unsettles historians. The fate of humanity decided over something so trivial. But what is more unsettling is the question it leaves hanging. If the gods acted on such petty impulses once, what would stop them from doing so again? Enki could not challenge the decree openly. The other gods would see to it that their plan remained intact. So instead, he spoke to a reed hut, not to a man directly, for that would violate the oath of secrecy, but knowing full well that Utnapishtim was within earshot. Reed hut, wall, wall, hear me, O man of Shurupak, son of Ubar Tutu. The message was clear. Build a boat. Not a simple fishing craft, but a vast vessel sealed with bitumen, capable of withstanding the fury of the gods. The instructions were precise. Dimensions, decks, storage for animals and grain. There was no poetry here, only engineering. And in those dry, methodical lines, you can almost feel the urgency, the ticking clock before the first dark clouds gathered. When the flood came, the tablets say it was not just rain, it was a cosmic assault. The heavens roared, the ground split, and torrents poured from both sky and earth. For 6 days and 7 nights, the winds screamed, and the waves crushed everything in their path. Even the gods, it is said, grew afraid of their own storm, cowering like dogs at the edge of the heavens. It's a strange, almost human image, the destroyers trembling before their own creation. And it begs the question, did they know something was going wrong? When the waters finally calmed, Utnapishtim's boat rested on a mountain, not Ararat as in the Bible, but Mount Naimush. He released a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven, just as Noah would in later retellings. The raven did not return. The land was drying. Then came the offering, a sacrifice to the gods. And here, the tone shifts sharply from the biblical version. The gods, smelling the offering, gathered like flies around it, not solemn, not holy, but hungry. This is no tale of a righteous God restoring balance. This is a story of flawed, greedy beings, granting survival not as a blessing, but as a concession. Utnapishtim and his wife were given immortality, exiled to live at the mouth of the rivers, far from the lands of men. But here's the detail most retellings skip. The text does not say they were the only survivors. It says the great flood had destroyed all other living beings. But the wording leaves room for doubt. And in other Mesopotamian traditions, older, fragmentary ones, there are hints of other survivors, on distant hills, in hidden valleys. People who did not step foot on Utnapishtim's ark, yet lived. In the next part, we'll follow those whispers, from half-buried Sumerian inscriptions to scattered myths in neighboring lands, to see if these forgotten survivors can be traced. Because if they existed, their fate might change everything we think we know about the world after the flood. Whispers beyond the ark. The official Sumerian flood myth, carved into the Deluge tablet, tells of Utnapishtim as the chosen survivor. But archaeology has a way of whispering when history shouts, and sometimes it whispers contradictions. Among the oldest tablets from cities like Nippur and Lagash, there are fragmentary flood accounts that differ subtly from the Gilgamesh version. One mentions those who took refuge in the highlands. Another speaks of the people of Dilmun, a distant, possibly island settlement, who were spared by the waters. These are not full stories, just fragments, as if someone tried to erase them, or perhaps the tales were never meant to be written in the first place. Could it be that the Great Deluge was not a total annihilation, but a selective disaster? If we retrace the geography of ancient Sumer, the possibility becomes clearer. The flood layer found at Shuruppak, and Kish shows devastation along the river plains, but it does not extend far into the Zagros foothills to the northeast. Those highlands, dotted with small farming settlements and caves, may have been untouched by the surge. And then there is Dilmun, a name that has drifted through our earlier episodes like a shadow. In Episode 4, we glimpsed it in connection to trade and myth. In Episode 5, we saw it hinted as a place of purity in Eridu's lore. The Sumerians described it as a bright land beyond the sea, where sickness did not exist. Many historians place it in what is now Bahrain. If Dilmun truly escaped the flood, its people may have carried with them an unbroken line of pre-deluge culture, a living thread from before the catastrophe. But if so, why did the main flood story erase them? The answer may lie in power. The post-flood kingship, according to the Sumerian king list, descended from heaven to Kish, not to Shuruppak, not to Dilmun. If rival survivors existed outside this narrative, they would represent a challenge to the authority of those who claimed divine right to rule after the flood. By reducing the flood's survivors to a single, God-appointed family, the storytellers could present all post-flood civilization as descending from one approved source. It's a reminder that myths don't just preserve memory, they also shape it. And sometimes, shaping the past means erasing pieces of it. Some of these erased pieces survive only as odd, seemingly disconnected details. A cylinder seal from Lagash shows a small group of people climbing a hill as water swirls below. No ark, no animals, no divine savior, just human instinct. A broken inscription from Nippur speaks of those who fled to the mountains and made covenant with no god. The language here is dangerous. It suggests people who survived without divine permission. If they existed, they were inconvenient survivors, the kind whose existence the official flood narrative would rather forget. In the next part, we'll dig deeper into the archaeology of these inconvenient survivors and see how trade routes, genetic clues, and even linguistic traces might reveal where they went after the floodwaters receded. And what we'll find could mean the post-flood world was far more divided than the Deluge tablet admits. The aftermath path. When the waters receded, the Sumerian king list claims kingship was restored at Kish, as if the world simply began anew from one city. But the ground tells a different story. Excavations at sites in the Zagros foothills, far beyond the reach of the Great Flood layer, reveal continuous occupation. At Jarmo, Choga Golan, and other early settlements, the pottery sequence shows no gap, no sudden absence of life, no post-deluge restart. These people never left. They never stopped. Which means they may have watched the flood from a distance, watching cities drown, knowing their own land would survive. If that's true, then Sumer's new beginning was not the whole beginning at all, and some survivors may have been much older than Utnapishtim's line. The trade routes offer another clue. Before the flood, we know Sumer traded with the East. Stone from Iran, timber from the Zagros, copper from Oman. After the flood, some of these trade networks resumed almost immediately, faster than one. Ark's survivors could have re-established them. This suggests merchants, miners, and craftsmen beyond the flood zone were ready to pick up exactly where they left off. It's like walking into a city after a disaster and finding the markets already stocked by people who never suffered the disaster at all. And then there's Dilmun. In the decades after the flood, artifacts linked to Dilmun begin appearing in southern Mesopotamia. Shell inlays, distinctive stamp seals, and luxury goods. To the Sumerians, Dilmun was a land of purity, a place untouched by the chaos of the flood. Was this the first contact between the flood survivors of Kish and the untouched survivors across the sea? Or was it a reunion, the reconnection of two worlds that had been separated during the deluge? The answer might be hidden in the way the Sumerians spoke of Dilmun, not as a place they discovered after the flood, but as a place that had always been there. Linguistic traces add yet another layer to the puzzle. While the Sumerian language itself is an isolate, unrelated to any known tongue, there are hints of pre-flood loanwords in the languages of the Zagros Highlands and the Gulf region. It's as if fragments of an older world survived in the speech of remote peoples, fragments the flood could not wash away. And if language can survive a flood, so can people. But if these people lived outside the gods' chosen lineage, what kind of relationship did they have with post-flood Sumer? Were they allies, silent neighbors, or the rivals that myths were designed to erase? Now we'll explore what happens when these two survivor worlds, the chosen and the forgotten, begin to overlap. Because somewhere in that overlap, the archaeology suggests there was a clash that may have shaped the entire post-flood political order. When survivors collide. For generations after the flood, the official Sumerian records tell a neat story. Kingship was restored, cities rose again, the gods were satisfied, and order returned. But the archaeology refuses to be neat. Somewhere between the rebuilding of Kish and the rise of Uruk's first great kings, there is a strange pattern in the layers. A brief period of abandonment in certain river cities, followed by sudden rebuilding with unfamiliar styles of pottery, tools, and even burial customs. It's as if a new people arrived, and the locals weren't entirely ready for them. The Sumerians themselves may have left us a hint. A handful of early post-flood tablets speak of the people who came from the high places, and the merchants of the far waters. The tone is wary, not welcoming. In one fragment from Nippur, the phrase used for these outsiders translates roughly to "those without offering," a dangerous label in a culture where divine approval defined legitimacy. To call someone without offering was to say they had no pact with the gods, and therefore no right to rule or even to exist within the sacred order of the cities. It's the kind of language that makes enemies before treaties. If the chosen survivors of Utnapishtim's lineage saw themselves as the rightful heirs of the world, then the highland and island survivors were a direct challenge, living proof that the gods' destruction had not been complete, and that divine favor was not the only path to survival. The clash may not have been open war, but it left traces. Fortifications along certain trade routes appear suddenly in the archaeological record. Not grand city walls, but smaller outposts positioned at choke points, controlling movement between the river plains and the foothills. Why build them unless someone, or something, was coming down from the mountains uninvited? And then there is the most tantalizing clue of all, the king list gap. Between certain post-flood rulers, there are unexplained reigns, kings whose names appear in some versions of the list, but vanish in others, as if erased. One such name is given only as King of the Boat People in a damaged tablet from Lagash. No dynasty, no father's name, just that title, and then nothing. It's almost as if someone briefly held power in Sumer, only to be scrubbed from the official history. If these were leaders from the forgotten survivors, their erasure would make perfect sense. And the fact that we even have this faint trace suggests their presence was too significant to be ignored completely, but too inconvenient to be remembered. In the next part, we'll follow this thread into the politics of early post-flood Sumer, where myth, memory, and propaganda blended to secure the rule of the chosen while quietly burying the legacy of everyone else. Because if the flood itself nearly erased humanity, the centuries after may have finished the job. The survivors and the scattered cities. When the waters finally began to recede, the land that emerged was not the same world the survivors had once known. Fields once thick with barley lay beneath layers of silt and clay. Entire river channels had shifted, as if the Euphrates and Tigris had chosen new paths without warning. The cities that had been centers of power, Shuruppak, Ur, Kish, were nothing more than ghostly mounds beneath a veil of mud. The survivors stepped into this silence, carrying only fragments of their former lives. In the Sumerian flood narrative, these survivors were not just random stragglers, they were hand-picked. Atrahasis, the man favored by the gods for his wisdom and humility, brought with him not just his family, but also the seeds of life, livestock, tools, and the memory of the old laws. He carried a compacted version of Sumer's entire civilization, hidden in the simplest objects. But here lies the mystery the tablet does not fully explain. Where did these people go? Some accounts suggest they returned to their old lands once the waters dried, founding new versions of the cities they had lost. Others hint at something stranger, small groups breaking away, disappearing into far-off lands, carrying the flood story with them until it took root in distant cultures. Archaeologists, when studying settlements that arose after the flood stratum, noticed something unusual. Certain cities seem to appear fully formed, as if their builders already knew the principles of Sumerian urban planning, agriculture, and temple construction. Was this because survivors spread their knowledge? Or is it possible that a pre-flood network of contact had existed, making the spread of culture inevitable after disaster struck? Some scholars point to the sudden flourishing of sites in northern Mesopotamia, far from the flood's deepest impact zone. Others argue the survivors may have moved eastward, toward the Zagros Mountains, leaving behind small enclaves whose ruins remain unstudied, buried beneath centuries of dust. Yet there's another layer to this mystery. Whispers from Sumerian priestly records that speak of a silent voyage. It describes a group who sailed away before the deluge's final surge, their destination unknown. Some believe they may have carried sacred objects, perhaps even tablets of knowledge older than the flood itself. If true, then the Great Deluge was not just a catastrophe. It was a cover for a mass relocation of secrets. And this is where the trail grows faint, as if the survivors wanted it that way. Which raises a haunting question. Did they vanish into history by accident, or was it by design? Because if these chosen few took their knowledge elsewhere, then the Great Flood wasn't the end of a civilization. It was the beginning of another. And there's a single, half-broken inscription found far from Sumer that might hold the first clue to where they went. The broken inscription. It was found far from the muddy plains of Mesopotamia, on a weathered stone slab deep in the hills near modern-day Iran. The characters carved into it were not quite Sumerian, yet their strokes and angles carried a familiar hand. Scholars debated for decades whether it was a local imitation or a genuine remnant carried by the flood's survivors. Only half of the inscription remained intact. The surviving lines spoke cryptically of the waters that swallowed the earth and the chosen who walked under a new sun. More intriguingly, it referenced a place called Dulhar, a name not found in any surviving Sumerian records. Some believe Dulhar was a settlement founded by those who refused to rebuild in the old floodplain, choosing instead to start anew in higher ground, beyond the reach of disaster. Excavations around the site uncovered fragments of pottery whose designs were unmistakably Sumerian, but the clay was not local. It had been carried there, fired in a style unique to the cities of the south. The question was no longer if survivors had traveled here, it was why. Perhaps they feared the wrath of the gods might come again. Perhaps they wished to keep their knowledge secret, away from the rival city-states that would inevitably rise once more. Or perhaps, as the decline in records after this period suggests, they were simply fewer in number, too scattered to sustain the vast networks that had once tied Sumer together. By the time new rulers rose in Mesopotamia, the survivors of the flood had already begun to fade from history. The memory of the event was preserved in myths and hymns, but the names of those who lived through it were lost. The Great Flood became a story, then a warning, then a shadow of something that might have been real. And as the last city of the old flood survivors crumbled into dust, it left behind nothing but fragments, broken tablets, worn symbols, and the faint suggestion that once, long ago, humanity had been given a second chance, and we still don't know what they did with it. Echoes beneath the sand. The last traces of the flood survivors did not vanish all at once. For centuries after the disaster, faint echoes of their influence would resurface, in a unique style of temple bricks found far from Sumer, in agricultural techniques too advanced to have been invented twice, in the quiet persistence of myths told in far-off lands. Even in the later empires, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, there are fragments that feel older. A hymn here, a set of measurements there, a word in a language that no one quite understood, but which scribes kept faithfully copying. They were seeds from a past no one could fully remember, only revere. The flood itself became a moral tale, a warning about the fragility of human achievement in the face of forces beyond control. Yet, buried in that warning, there is also something else, a sense of resilience, that even after the rivers rose, after the temples were swallowed, after the kings and their armies vanished, someone still chose to plant crops, to rebuild walls, to carve symbols into stone in the hope they might outlast the wind. Today, when archaeologists kneel in the dust and brush away the centuries, they are not just uncovering clay and stone. They are touching the edges of a story so old it no longer has a beginning or an end. The people of Sumer may be gone, their cities now only whispers in the earth, but the lessons they left behind still hum quietly in the background of our own civilization. They remind us that progress is not a straight line, that power can be washed away in a single season, and that perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave is not monuments, but the will to start again. And so, somewhere beneath the shifting sands of time, Sumer still breathes, not in grandeur, but in the small, stubborn heartbeat of humanity itself. Stay connected for the next Sumerian episode, only on Nexora.